Alright, good evening everyone. My name is Benjamin, and seriously sorry for the late upload today. I had some stuff I had to take care of after work. Anyway, before we get started, a like, a comment, and a subscription would be greatly appreciated, as well as maybe a subscription to my Patreon. And any important links I have will be in the description. And today we're continuing my series on American history. And we're going to be doing as close to a deep overview of the Constitutional Convention as possible. And that's actually one of the reasons why I felt it necessary to delay publishing this episode or recording it to begin with. Because it's very in-depth. I reread Madison's notes on the convention. I have that book. I think it's on my nightstand right now. Yeah, it's on my nightstand right now. But anyway, I read some other sources, and Senator Mike Lee's book, Written Out of History, was also very useful in bringing to light some of the discussion of the debates from there from a different perspective. And we'll talk about that more in the next two episodes of this series, because those are going to be on the ratification debates, because I think those are separate to the Constitutional Convention themselves. And specifically, I'm going to talk about Elbridge Gerry and Luther Martin when we get to that, as well as George Mason, because George Mason was really incredibly intelligent. Anyway, so the original intent for this convention was for the founders, or a lot of the very important figures in the nation, to come together in Philadelphia and strengthen the Articles of Confederation. However, very quickly, basically to lightly paraphrase Patrick Henry, I smell a rat in Philadelphia that tends towards monarchy. And yes, you can hear the cat outside, because he is liable to jump on the computer, turn everything off, open all sorts of tabs. I can't let him in here, because that's all he does. Anyway, yeah, Patrick Henry may have been correct. And that's going to be a theme that we find when we get to the Anti-Federalist episode of this series. But Madison came extremely prepared. That's James Madison, by the way. Because he had decided that he was going to do as much research on republics, democracies, and any other form of self-governing in order to learn what the failures of those had been and see if they could be improved. And he authored what is commonly known as the Virginia Plan, which is very overarching. But we're going to focus on the legislative part, because the executive and judiciary, they went through a number of forms that, to be quite honest, while definitely more interesting than is often described in history books, it's relatively easy to understand why they were chosen why they were decided upon the way they eventually were. Now, Madison, he didn't want what would be known as a tyranny of the majority. But his initial plan, which is now known as the Virginia Plan, but also look up Pinckney's plan. That's Charles Pinckney of South Carolina, who came up with another very similar plan to the Virginia Plan. It was just slightly different, but a lot of his ideas crept in. It featured a bicameral legislature, it's 2 chambers, and both were apportioned either via tax revenue generated by that state or by population. Now, the original plan specifically was non-slave population. Yeah. Very interesting. The lower half, the lower chamber, would have been directly elected, and the upper house would be elected by the lower house from nominees proposed by each state's legislature. Now, interesting, but there was some dissent in that one member from Pennsylvania said, wait a second, we were brought here to change the Articles of Confederation, to strengthen them. And while I agree with some of the things you're suggesting for our national government, this is beyond what we were sent here to do. And that was William Patterson. The heck? You okay, Kai? Yeah, I know. Anyway. Eventually, even the pre-Great Compromise or Connecticut Compromise, whatever you learned it as, even then there was a compromised version of the Virginia plan where the Senate would be chosen by the state legislatures. And of course, this is one of the first places where the 3/5 compromise pops up, which is basically population apportionment should be done by the state's free population as well as 3/5 or 60% of their enslaved population. Obviously, this would benefit the South. Now, I'm going to move on to the executive really quickly. And by the way, the Article 3 branch, the Supreme Court, did not change all that much other than appointment. And that's not even a joke. The founders really, truthfully, didn't spend a ton of time on the judiciary other than to debate what its function would be. And they were just like, we still don't know. It should be the final arbiter, but that's about it. And it should be independent from the other branches. That's pretty much their entire thought process. That said, the Supreme Court has kind of carved out its own niche. And we'll talk about that in a future episode when we talk about John Marshall. And we're going to have to inevitably talk about Marbury v. Madison, which I think is actually the most overrated court case in U.S. history. But that's my opinion. Now, the executive. The founders saw very few examples of a non-hereditary executive. You had the Confederation in Switzerland, which had not a single head of state, but an executive council, effectively. And the only other examples that were contemporary to the founders were the Holy Roman Empire and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And both were seen as corrupt. And the Dutch Republic also had an elected head of state, though it almost always fell to a member of the House of Orange. The Holy Roman Empire was seen as corrupt, number one, because of Habsburg always won, but also because it was a terrible system of electing a monarch or a head of state. Like, criticize the Electoral College all you want, but if you want to see how to screw up an election system, look at how the HRE did it. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, their method of electing a king/Grand Duke, yeah, that was not much better, if we're 100% honest, because it required way too many people in order to get enough votes within the Sejm to elect a monarch, but it also required, well, at the end of the day, a lot of foreign influence crept in. And by the end, most kings of the Polish-Lithuania, kings of Poland, Grand Dukes of Lithuania, heads of state of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, most of them were puppets of either Prussia, Austria, or Russia. But most of the founders wanted a weaker chief executive who, if they vetoed a law, they were even debating not giving what we now call the president veto power. But most wanted Congress to be able to override a veto if they gave the president veto power. Connecticut, of course, there was a plan, I think it was the New Jersey plan, that said, no, we need to keep, every state gets one vote. Connecticut said, no, we can work this out. Let's have each state have 3 senators in the upper chamber, which will be determined by the state legislatures, and the lower house will be apportioned by population, with with 3/5 of the slave population counting as well, just to make the southern states happy. And we'll choose a number of people that each house seat should represent, and we'll allow Congress to change apportionment with population. And speaking of, let's include a census provision. Every 10 years seems reasonable. Actually, I don't think that was part of the Connecticut Compromise. I think that was actually outlined in the Virginia plan. But basically, the founders thought, our population is going to grow as a nation. We should probably change house apportionment to fit that. Now, there were a few people, when all was said and done, all the branches of government, the amendment process, the census, everything was put together. A lot of them got out and signed it, but there were non-signatories. By the way, here in this oil painting, obviously George Washington was elected, I think unanimously, as the president of the convention. You have Benjamin Franklin there sitting in the middle, and go figure, it's Ben Franklin who one of a small handful of people who signed both the Constitution and the Declaration. But there's 2 people who add in the other one of America's founding documents, the Articles of Confederation. Those were Roger Sherman and Robert Morris. Now, there were a few non-participants, and I'll just name them and talk about some of the reasons why. Patrick Henry, well, we discussed, he thought there was something fishy going on, and he would also become an Anti-Federalist. John Hancock, I think he was actually busy in Massachusetts. Sam Adams, probably the same thing, though Sam Adams was kind of different than John and than his cousin John Adams. Sam Adams, if I remember correctly, was more Anti-Federalist. John Adams was in Britain, serving as what we would now call the ambassador to Great Britain. And Thomas Jefferson was in France, being ambassador to France. Now, there were 3 delegates to the convention who refused to sign. A few didn't sign the final draft, but there were 3 who outright refused to sign it. not, but most agreed with it. The three who didn't were Edmund Randolph, the governor of Virginia. Yeah, you want to talk about pissing someone off. Talk about someone not to piss off. It's the governor of the largest state in the Union. Um, in all seriousness, he was not a big fan of the. Uh, he he was kind of also anti-federalist in a lot of ways. He thought the document needed a lot more revision, but he also thought it needed a Bill of Rights and a few other things. George Mason, similar reasons. And we'll talk about George Mason when we get to the ratification debates, because, yeah. Also, George Mason, the father of the Second Amendment, so you know I like him. In all seriousness, he was kind of a flawed person. I'm just going to straight out say that. And then you have Elbridge Gerry, who we're also going to talk a lot about in a future episode, because not only are we going to talk about him in ratification debates, we're going to talk about him when we get to... oh... Elbridge Gerry, you are now remembered more for what you've done to maps than you ever will be remembered for being an actually decent governor and an actually decent intellectual with regards to debates on the Constitution. Yeah. He's remembered more for making funny shapes on a map than any of his other work. It's kind of a shame. Anyway, I'm going to wrap this up here. I hope everyone enjoyed. I'll see y'all next time. Take it easy. Have a very nice day.